You're listening to The Pastors Collective with Greg Surratt and Darrin Patrick. On each episode of our show, you'll hear from pastors around the country about the real work of pastoring, stories from the trenches of ministry that reveal the joys, heartaches, and grace that come from leading and serving in local churches. This episode was recorded at the 2019 Art Conference in Birmingham, Alabama. Pastor Darrin sat down with Billy Mills from Reverb Church in St. Augustine, Florida, where he serves as part of their pastoral team. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the show.
Billy Mills.
Yes, sir.
Reverb Church. It's not Augustine, it's Augustine.
Yeah.
Do Reformed guys say Augustine when they ask you where you're from?
They probably do, but if I say Augustine, no one in my city knows what I'm talking about.
That's right. So, brother, tell us, man. So we're new friends, and you've been telling me a little bit about your story. As you know, you guys that have been listening, you know that what we're trying to do with this podcast is we're trying to talk about not just the glory stories, but the gory stories. We're trying to get behind the scenes of, you know, when you plant a church, when you pastor a church, you've got a story that you bring into that. And the story of the church and the story of ministry can be very beautiful, but a lot of times it's also broken.
Yeah.
So, brother, just tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, man. So grew up in church and good kid, good family, and loved God, loved serving, loved everything, right? High school, everything was good. Nothing crazy was happening. Went to college, Bible college. Halfway through Bible college,
Where'd you go?
I went to Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Independent Baptist Fundamental
Independent Baptist
Bible
in the
College. About halfway through college, changed my major from music to missions and started a trajectory towards serving God overseas. Loved it, seemed to have a desire and a love for other cultures, learning cultures, kind of figuring out other cultures, trying to figure out, all right, what's the best ways to take the gospel even into that culture. Went on a couple short-term trips, served a summer in Jamaica in 1998. As soon as I graduated, got invited by someone in my church who supported a missionary overseas in Portugal. They paid my way to go spend a summer and work at a youth camp in Portugal, which if you're a recent college grad, somebody gives you a couple $1,000s and says, go spend a summer in Europe, you just go. And so there in that summer, I met my wife. She was just graduated from college herself. She's Portuguese. She was working at the same camp. Met her, just kind of, I'd love to say we hit it off. The director of the camp actually wouldn't let me talk to her. So he made me pray for an entire year before I'd come back and actually have a conversation with her, which I did. Came back a year later and proposed. In our first conversation, we ended up getting married.
Wow.
About a year later. Then we got married, went and spent a year in South America with the same organization called Word of Life Fellowship. And we spent some time there, about a year, came back to the States, raised a little bit more support, and then went to Portugal as church planners. And so the ironic thing was I had a Bible college degree, but I knew nothing about church planning. Just four-year degree, all the desires in the world, but we had left our mission organization, which was a youth organization, Bible clubs. We wanted to get more in church planning, so we went without a mission board. Figured since my wife was Portuguese, we had a lot of family. We had a sort of a foundation to live from and serve from. So we did that. The problem with all of that was behind the scenes for many years, there were some issues, there were some problems, there were some addictions that for a lot of years kind of remained hidden. Not a lot of people knew about them. I even thought that they were past sins, past things that I had dealt with because they just hadn't flared up, hadn't had any struggles or issues with, and a lot of that was sex addiction, pornography, things like that. Then I get
So you're
overseas.
saying you were removed from that for a few years.
Right.
Okay.
I wasn't in an environment where faced with certain temptations, especially living in South America, there was no cell phone, there was no internet, there's no even opportunity for certain things to even manifest. Living in sort of like a little microcosm, a little bubble on a property where there's 1,000 people. We got a Bible Institute, you're in ministry, your life sort of exists within that bubble. And so for several years, there was no struggle, there was no even temptation. But I went from single to being married in that time. And then all of a sudden I find myself overseas, and there's little things that you see, and all of a sudden I become curious about things. Long story short, over about a 1 to 2.5 year period, being exposed to certain things and places. Really, it was the places. Never forget walking down a busy street in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and getting an invitation from a 20-some-year-old girl to come check out a club. And you walk in, and it's different than what we would know as some kind of club or a strip club in the United States. These are brothels. These are all kinds of things that I'd never seen. And it started out as a curiosity for me. It's like, I can't believe this place exists. So go home, and it never left my mind. And then the next time you're in the capital, which is maybe 2 or 3 months later, I wonder if that's the only place or if there are places just like it. And then what began to happen over 2 or 3 years, not only in Argentina, but when I moved back to Portugal, again, as church planners, in the back of my mind is, you can probably find these places here too. And for me, there was a line that I said, well, I'll draw this line here. I won't do A, B, and C, but I'll just kind of go and I'll kind of check things out, and I'll just kind of keep it under wraps.
See, I did the same thing. I had this weird legalism. I would not look at pornography on my computer or my iPad, but I would look at it on my phone. You want to know why?
Yeah.
Because I worked on my sermons on my iPad and my computer.
Yeah.
It's weird how we
compartmentalize.
We do these, yeah.
Yeah. And
so you were doing that.
So the crazy thing was, as I began to go to these places, the temptation to do certain things or act out in certain ways was enormous. But again, I had this line that I said I wouldn't cross. And one of the other things that I would use to sort of justify this behavior was, hey, I'm going to these places and I'm treating these women with respect. I'm treating them with dignity. I'm paying them, but I'm not expecting certain favors. I'm not. I say this to myself in my mind: as long as I'm here and not doing A, B, and C, as long as I'm not having sex or I'm not taking advantage of these women, then I'm okay.
And you're doing ministry at this time.
Oh yeah.
What were you doing? What kind of ministry?
So I was on the pastoral staff at one of the churches we worked with. I wasn't the lead pastor. I was helping out a pastor who was a longtime friend. When I first went to Portugal, I met his sons, who were teenagers. They were a little bit younger than I, and they were working with us in the camp that we worked at. And so I developed a friendship. And so when we moved back to that area, northern Portugal, there weren't a lot of churches to partner with. And there weren't a lot of relationships that we had established. We had a really good relationship with this pastor, with this church. He spoke at our wedding, loved his family. We were involved with the church, and we were trying to plant a work in another city about an hour north, where of all things that the Lord gave us the opportunity to do was coaching and playing baseball. We had met a family that invited us out to lunch on Christmas Eve. I go into the restaurant, I'm going to the bathroom during lunch, and I see this poster with a Mike Mussina on it, "Do you love baseball?" in Portuguese.
Wow.
And found out there's a semi-pro baseball team in Portugal and a league. I went and tried out, made the team, started playing on the adult team, started coaching in the youth team,
wow.
Building incredible relationships, loving God, serving God, but this, secret compartment of my life.
Okay, so a lot of people ask this question, and if you never really crashed and burned, it makes no sense to a person. How do you do that? How do you have this part of your life that is clearly, I mean, some things are kind of gray. Should I watch a rated R movie? Should I, how many glasses of wine? I mean, there's some, but going to brothels,
nothing
I think
gray
we've got
about
verses.
It. Yeah.
So how did you do that? Like, how did you compartmentalize? What lies did you tell yourself?
Right. So the first lies I began to tell myself was, okay, I can stop. I can fix this. And so I'll read a book. I'll do a Bible study. I'll find some way to stop. And so I, go on Amazon. I order all the books that I need to read to try to stop. That didn't work. So the next lie I told myself was, I'll get some help. I'll get some personal help. So I contacted a counselor who lived in Atlanta, Georgia. And I start counseling with him over the internet and over email. And the problem, and that was helping, but it wasn't working, because what he was saying, here's what you need to do. You need to confess your sin. You need to look at somebody in the eyes, and you need to tell them what's going on. You need to tell them what you're doing. But
someone, meaning your wife?
Someone, my wife, a pastor, a friend, somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody else who had to know.
Yeah.
Right? Because I wasn't going to stop as long as anybody knew, or as long as no one knew. And so I didn't like his advice, because that meant losing everything that was dear to me. And I'll never forget, one day I even wrote down a list. Here's the pros and cons. If I confess, here's the pros and cons. The pros, I might actually get some help. The cons, I might lose my wife. I might lose my daughter.
How old was your daughter?
My daughter was 1 year old at the time. She's my oldest. She's about to turn 14 next week.
Wow.
And so all that, kind of going through my mind, I might lose anything. And then one day I was sitting with my wife, we were watching TV, and remarkably, there was a story on TV that was in some ways similar to our own. And my wife looked at me at some point during the conversation. She said, if you're ever struggling with something like that, I'd rather not know.
Wow.
And in that moment, I told myself, well, then no one will ever know. I'll keep with the struggle. I'll keep trying to do both. I'll keep trying to love God and serve God and do this. But I couldn't stop, and I wasn't stopping. And then one day, is in a brothel. It was in our hometown. The amazing thing was that this brothel was in a coffee shop. So imagine going into Starbucks, and you're ordering your coffee, but back in the corner, there's 3 or 4 young women sitting in the corner, and you could just walk up to any one of them, motion towards them, and they would open a door, and it leads to a staircase that goes upstairs, and there's all these rooms above the coffee shop.
Wow.
And the reality kind of sank in that day that this isn't, prostitution. It's not anything other than sex trafficking. It's human trafficking. That's what's going on. As I begin to hear these stories and realize that I'm not helping these people, I'm hurting them. I'm the reason that they're here, and I became disgusted with myself to the point where I realized there's going to come a day I'm going to cross a line.
So if I can just,
yeah,
what did you do? Like, what was the line?
The line was I wouldn't have sex.
So everything else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I would talk. I would, any kind of physical intimacy. I'm not going to have sex. Not going to have sex with these women. That's the line that I drew. That I said I'll do anything short of this.
Wow.
Right. But the problem is that it was taking a toll on me that I never had imagined. It was destroying everything on the inside.
Yeah.
It was destroying zeal. It was destroying love for people. It was destroying any hopes we had to build anything there. I was becoming paranoid, thinking, hey, everybody knows.
Catch me, yeah.
My wife knows. Everybody knows, and then I'm going to lose everything.
So how did all this get exposed?
So I got to the point where I just couldn't live with myself anymore. Not to the point where I became suicidal or anything, but discouraged, depressed. I couldn't look myself in the mirror anymore with any self-respect. And so one day I told my wife, we have to leave. The only way in my mind I figured I can deal with this, I have to get out of the country. I have to get away from the things that I thought were tempting me, which in reality, this is everywhere. You can do this anywhere, but overseas I could do it, and I thought I could remain anonymous.
Yeah.
It's one thing to walk into a strip club or a bar in your hometown. It's another thing to go to a country where nobody knows you.
Right.
In
Different
large
hemisphere.
cities. Right. And feel like you can be anonymous. So I made up some lies to my wife. We're going to go home. We're going to go back to the States, and here's why. And for whatever reason, she believed the lies of why we're going to go back to the States. I remember calling my pastor, calling friends, hey, we're coming back from the mission field, which we were so zealous for years, to do nothing. We don't have a plan. We just have to leave the mission field. And so we came home, and that was July, I believe we came home, 2006. And then finally, World Series game, you might appreciate this one. I was finally saying, tonight's the night, watching the World Series, 2006, St. Louis Cardinals, Detroit Tigers.
Yes.
I was watching that game, Game 6. It was the last game of the World Series, and I told myself, if she watches the game with me, I'll tell her. And my wife...
Let me correct you. It was only 5 games.
5 games. It was Game 5?
And I was at Game 5
while
you were getting ready to confess all this to your wife. Wow.
So she stayed up uncharacteristically. She doesn't watch baseball. She doesn't like baseball. But I was still playing at the time. I was playing semi-pro ball in Portugal. And when you hear semi-pro ball, think more like high school baseball level. It was not glamorous.
That's right.
It was very terrible.
Heavy emphasis on the semi.
Right.
Of the pro.
And so she stayed up, watched the game, and when the game was over, I just began to weep and came clean, confessed everything, told her everything that had been happening for a several-year period, asked her forgiveness, and basically asked the question, how in the world do we start over? And, we laid down in bed that night right next to our daughter, who was sleeping in a little Graco playpen next to us in my parents' office at their house, and we cried all night and laid there and just kind of asked ourselves, how did this happen?
Yeah.
And where do we go from here? And we started rebuilding in October of 2006.
Wow. So I'm assuming a lot of counseling.
Yeah. counseling and taking some huge steps back from ministry and try to be healthy, try to be whole. And that was kind of step one, trying to do that under the radar. And so we did a lot of that under the radar with the counseling, pastoral counseling, but still the world didn't know our story. Our friends didn't know our story. Our family didn't know our story, because I was willing to get help, but I wasn't willing to get help in the fact that I wanted everyone to know.
Right. Yeah.
I just wanted a few people to know, so I could get help, but I didn't want anybody else to know that part of the story. And that lasted probably until 2013. And when I began to realize, listen, look at what God has done in my life. Look at how he's transformed my life. And he's not ashamed of me. He's not ashamed of what I've done. He's not ashamed of anything, to the fact that he would forgive me, he would cleanse me, renew me, restore me. Why in the world am I ashamed of him? Or why would I be ashamed to allow people to see what he covered, what he cleansed me from, what he restored me from? And then it became a desire of ours to not only tell our story, but to use it as sort of the launching pad for ministry. This is the reason we do what we do, because the gospel is not just the gospel for good kids who grew up in church that didn't look at themselves as though they were bad or wicked or in need of a whole lot of grace, but the gospel is for wretches like me who are absolutely corrupt and in desperate need of a miracle of God.
Amen.
And so that became man, God's done this in us. We got to tell our story.
Wow.
And my wife, man, she's amazing. She's an incredible woman. I got to see in a real tangible way what God's grace looks like with skin on.
Yeah.
There's a lot of women, a lot of people, and nothing against them, that would not have forgiven someone or would not have come back from something like that. But to be willing to help me walk through that and even to rebuild trust and to rebuild a life together after that, it's been amazing. And so that's kind of the story of the tattoo that's on my arm.
Yeah.
Because it's the vine from John 15. So it starts on my chest. We have these roots, and it just wraps up around my shoulder, and it's one vine. It's got the fruit of the Spirit tattooed on all different parts of the vine. Jesus' words in John 15, I'm the vine, you're the branches, abide in me. And then this one vine, the main branch, comes down to my ring finger where my wife's name's on it.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have our 3 girls' names on my fingers. But at the time, we had one daughter, Lydia, and so my wife had a choice. All those years ago, 13 years ago now, to forgive or to move on, to restore and rebuild something we had, our life, our marriage, or to say, you know what, this hurts too much. I'm gonna start over. And she chose to forgive. She chose to rebuild, to restore, to allow God to do something. And had she not done that, then there's a lot of fruit of our lives that wouldn't be here. And so sometimes in counseling and telling our stories, I tell people, listen, rebuilding a broken world is difficult. It's hard work. It's painful work, but it's worth it because there's fruit afterwards that would never have been there without the forgiveness, without the grace. And so what I love to do is call my 2 youngest daughters up, their names are Lily and Leah. Leah's 9, Lily's 6. And I tell people, this is the fruit of forgiveness.
Wow.
This is the fruit of redemption. Without forgiveness, without the grace, these 2 little girls wouldn't have been here. But now they're here. And there's so much more fruit than that. And so now their names are tattooed on my fingers as after a post-redemptive, kind of process in our story. And then we lost one in between, June 12, 2011. And right on that branch that's cut off, it's John 15, 2. Every branch that in me does bear fruit, he cleans it, right? He purges it so that it might bear more fruit. And so we try to share and live and show that, listen, none of us are good people. Whether you grew up in church and you just did normal bad stuff like some people, or if you went to the lengths of, hitting up brothels all over South America and Western Europe, like me, that I'd consider, along with most people would consider me a pretty bad guy, pretty bad dude to do those things, to go those places. And yet God's grace cleanses and forgives and covers all that. It certainly doesn't excuse it, and it's certainly not a license to go back to it. But what the reality is there's none of us that are too far gone, that are to think that God's grace can't forgive us or can't cleanse us, can't restore us, can't bring us back from the places we've gone.
It's so easy as pastors and church folk to go, it's kind of us versus them. We're the good guys. and they're the bad guys, but really we're all the bad guys, and
Yeah.
Jesus is the good guy.
Absolutely. Right.
So, what steps have you put in place around purity?
Yeah.
That would, you just think about a young pastor, and just the reality is, you may be listening to this and going, "Oh my gosh, like that! I never heard of anything like that in my life." Well, I have.
Yeah.
Maybe not the extreme of, the length of time, and maybe the different country, but this story is common.
Yeah.
Pastors are
Too common.
medicating with illicit stuff all the time, and so you've got some pastors in that place where they are greatly tempted or have given in. What would you tell them? And maybe even some of the examples of how you have set, some boundaries and stuff in your life to protect you.
Yeah. So for the first part, if somebody's kind of struggling in a similar vein, or whether it's the same kind of sin or a different sin, I would say get some help. You need to tell somebody, right? And the sooner you talk, the sooner you get some help, the easier the conversation is. I can wish now, 13, 14 years later, that I would have taken the advice of that counselor from Atlanta and had that conversation maybe a year or two earlier and spared some of the additional pain or some of the additional experience. But I didn't want to. But I'll tell you this, if you don't want to look at another pastor or another friend or another person in the eyes today, just imagine looking your wife in the eyes 2 or 3 years after, with all the rest of the wreckage and the sin and the destruction that happens, because it's only a matter of time. The conversation's going to be had, right? You're either going to choose when to have the conversation, or you're going to choose not to have the
those
conversation.
words in the Old Testament from Moses, be sure your sin will find you out.
And my wife, when we've talked to people and told the stories, one of the questions that I've asked her over the years and that she's answered to others is, how could you forgive, right? How could you trust? And she'll tell people one of the number one ways that she was able to forgive and regain trust is the fact that I wasn't busted, but I confessed.
You didn't get caught.
Right? Because if, say if I get caught in a lie or caught in a scheme and I say I'm sorry, well, there's always, whether we want it to be there or not, there's always going to be that element, well, is he really sorry?
Yeah.
Or is he sorry because he got caught?
Yeah.
And the reality is we left everything behind that we loved, because whether I was in a really good spot at the time or not, I knew that I couldn't stay and change.
So that's a principle too. Like, if there's an environment, if there is a person that you go, if I'm in that environment or around this person, I'm not going to be able to stay pure.
That's right.
You got to get out of that. You got to get away from the person. You got to get out of the environment. Yeah.
And so for several years, the rebuilding process looked different. A couple different stages. For a while, it was, hey, we had no internet in our house. I didn't trust myself around internet. I didn't have a smartphone. There weren't as many smartphones back then, but they were available.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have a smartphone. I didn't want to have
the flip phone for a little bit longer than you could have. Yeah.
People mocked me, but again, not everyone knew the story. But and there's been times since where I've thought about going back to because the reality is, living in a life in a world where I can relieve myself of some of those temptations, it's just easier.
Yeah.
If I can get rid of some of those things, and again, I've been the same way. It's easy to not do it on my laptop, or it's easy to not do it on my iPad, because those are accessible, or they're ministry tools. One of the things I do now, my almost 14-year-old daughter doesn't want me to necessarily look on her cell phone, but I do. I check her cell phone out, and sometimes I'm like, listen, here's mine. I'm going to look at yours. You want to look at mine?
Wow.
You want to check up on me? Let's have some conversations.
That's powerful.
That's probably the biggest thing that for me that's helped over the years. Keep telling my story. Keep telling people this is who I was. This is what I was doing. Because there's a purifying element of always being reminded of God's grace. Romans chapter 2, right? Don't be deceived. Remember, it's the goodness of God that leads you to repentance. So constantly telling people about God's grace in my life, constantly telling people how amazing my wife is because of her ability to forgive and restore. Telling the stories helpful. There's a redemptive aspect in that, but I'm a fool if that's all I do. Right? There's boundaries. There's things you got to put in place. Whether it's software, there's some great things out there. Whether it's X3 watch, things that you can put on your phone.
Covenant Eyes, yeah.
Right? Covenant Eyes. There's some great things. And then it's just accountability, giving people access to ask you difficult questions and being willing to ask those same questions. Over the years, we actually started a nonprofit for several years that we ran, and we kind of let it go away and just partnered with some other organizations that are doing some of the similar things. But as we tell our story, and we would go around, we say, hey, Pastor, you should help us do some accountability and all these things. And sometimes people get, that'd be great, man. I would love to have some accountability. And other times people didn't want accountability.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that people didn't always want to ask me questions, because then they would be afraid that I might ask them the same questions. Yeah. And so the reality is there's a lot of areas of our hearts that we're not always willing to give people access to, because we have something to hide. And the more vulnerable we can be today, the more healthy we will be tomorrow. And again, just giving access, tell your story. Don't be ashamed of our struggles, our weakness, our failure. I mean, read the scriptures, right? We should never be surprised when we see men who love God or women who love God are also capable of doing some pretty messed up things while simultaneously loving God.
Yeah.
Because it's just the way we are. We're human. We're weak. We're frail. And so I find great comfort in David's story and Abraham's stories and Moses' stories because I see myself there. I see that same weakness, and I don't ever want to go back.
Amen.
I couldn't look at myself in the mirror 13, 14 years ago. I can't even imagine the pain and the shame of looking back now and going, you knew better. You knew better, and you still chose to go back. I don't ever want that to happen.
Dude, that was awesome. Wow.
Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our show, please take a minute to leave us a rating and a review in iTunes. You can learn more about each episode and find transcripts at www.pastorscollective.com. Our show was executive produced by Greg Surratt and Darrin Patrick. It's produced by Mike Cosper and Narrativo Group. This episode was recorded and mixed by TJ Hester. Our music is by Dan Phelps. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.